Hello, and welcome to the podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the Zodiac. When I give a reading for people, I typically start with a little intro in case they've never touched astrology, just kind of briefly going over what we would see in a birth chart, right? What is the zodiac signs? What are the planets? I don't go into super depth, but mostly just so people have some semblance of what they're looking at and some kind of the basic underlying principles. Because I'm always of the opinion that if you understand something, even at a baseline level, as you're working through it, that'll help you reach even more and better understanding, better equip you to deal with things as you move along. So this episode's kind of going to be a more in-depth variation of that to an extent. We're not going to talk about the planets. We might not get to the elements depending on how long this goes. So we'll see. But if we look at a birth chart, for example, the very, very basic thing, obviously, is it's divided into 12 sections, right? You've got your 12 signs. And then we'll notice the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, IC. The ascendant is going to be the eastern horizon at the time of birth, which means the descendant is the western horizon. So that means anything above that axis in a birth chart was in the sky, and anything below was below the sky. Now, with the 12 quadrants, the zodiac signs, why were they designed the way that they were? Why is there 12? Well, there's a couple conceptual reasons for this. The first is if we were to take the sun, watch the sun, because you got to remember, a lot of this stuff was designed by people who had no access to computers, no access to electricity. It was designed thousands of years ago from simply observing nature, observing astronomy, what they saw in the sky, and then marking it down and taking note and going from there, and eventually doing math and calculations, kind of extrapolating. But it was mostly just pure observation. So if we were to watch the sun anywhere on Earth, doesn't matter where, we'll notice that it doesn't really rise in the same exact spot every day. It actually slowly shifts, and it's going to slowly shift kind of almost back and forth a little bit, and then eventually get back 1 year later to the exact same spot as when we first started. And if we watch the arc of the sun, it kind of follows a similar pattern, where it kind of shifts slightly over the course of the year, more drastically if you're farther north or south. But the arc of the sun changes slightly over the course of a year. So that's the first thing they noticed. Okay, the sun's kind of moving around, right? And it's where it's at in the sky. The second thing, and it's consistent. You got a year between when it's repeating, right? Yearly cycle. With that, they obviously noticed the seasons kind of happen. You have 4 seasons over the course of, right, 1 year. Okay, so that's kind of nice. Now, with the moon, if we were to watch it, we would notice it's about 30 days. It's not exactly, it's slightly under, but about 30 days between full moons or new moons, depending on which one you want to track. Full moon's a little easier because we can see it. So you'll have about 30 days between full moons, right? And if we have 1 year divided by 30 days, what do we get? We get about 360 days, right? So you got a couple days extra. It's not a full calendar year as we know it, but back in the day, that was good enough. And so a lot of early calendars were actually lunar calendars, right? It's easy to track. You just look up at the moon, see where it's at, and bam. Obviously, you had extra days to contend with, and different civilizations kind of came up with different ideas for how to handle that once they realized it. And that's why a lot of history is kind of funky and weird for historians, because you got to deal with different calendars, different timings for different things. And so, yeah, it gets kind of wonky, kind of frustrating at times, because it's not always clear when stuff would have been because of this, how different cultures handled those different days and shifts and stuff. It's not the most difficult problem, but it does add some complexity to things. Now, that's the baseline. So that's an early reason why there was 12 is because you just and if you map this out on a circle, right, following the sun as it goes around the circle to get to the same spot, well, you'll notice that the full moons actually seem to be essentially filling out 12 different spots on the circle, making a nice, easy chart, right? Nice, easy chart divided 30 degrees essentially each time. The full moon would be 30 degrees in a different spot. And so that was kind of one of the early ways where we saw, okay, 12 makes sense. Now, another thing is I mentioned the sun, it kind of, right, we see the sun's arc kind of move slightly, right, throughout the course of the year. If you ever look at a map or a globe, you'll notice there's 3 lines typically. The equator, which everybody knows what the equator is, right? Kind of the transition between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. It's where it tends to be pretty hot. As a kid, I always thought that's where the sun is directly over at all times. It's actually not the case. If you were to look at the sun's where it's directly overhead, right? I'm in Southern California. The sun is actually never directly overhead here. It's always slightly off center during the summer, and then during the winter it's a little bit further. Right? The arc never gets exactly 90 degrees over the earth. Well, if you go down further, there are periods where that will actually be the case, but it will not stay exactly overhead for the entirety of the year, right? If it kind of shifts, and that has to do with the earth being tilted, and as it moves around the sun, the tilt obviously kind of tilts away, and then it tilts back, and so on. But what that comes out to is you have these 2 other lines on a map, right? The Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And those lines mark if we're looking at from where the sun is directly overhead, that is 90 degrees from the surface, it kind of actually follows this little, almost like a sine wave. It starts, let's say, at the equator, and it will move north until it gets to the Tropic of Cancer, and then that's where it will pivot and begin moving back south in terms of being where it's directly overhead. And then once it gets back to the equator, it then keeps moving even further south to the Tropic of Capricorn, where it again will pivot and turn back north. And so you get the sun slowly moving up and down in this band, right, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, with the equator being kind of the middle point. Now, speaking as somebody who's in the northern hemisphere, right, when the sun is on the north of the equator, the days are growing until they reach the Tropic of Cancer, and then they are shrinking until they reach the Tropic of Capricorn, with the equator, again, being kind of that middle divisor between the two, right? If that's kind of the length of the day is even, anything above, anything to the north would be longer days, anything below would be shorter days, and about an equivalent amount, roughly. And so that's kind of how we can measure or look at where the sun will be in the sky, right? If the sun is closer in the year, right, because it's getting towards summer, whatever, obviously, me being in Southern California, as the sun moves up, as we move towards summer, and it moves up towards the Tropic of Cancer, the arc of the sun for me here in Southern California will get closer and closer to 90 degrees. Never hits it for me in Southern California because I'm not within that band, but it will get it kind of to its highest point. And then obviously if you were in the Southern Hemisphere, that would be the lowest point in the arc. And then as it kind of moves back up, or I should say moves back south to the Tropic of Capricorn, it would then, for people in the Southern Hemisphere, move to its highest point. But those, essentially you have 4 points though, right? You have the point at the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, and then you have the 2 times the sun will cross the equator. So when it reaches each of those 4 points, you get either the summer or winter solstice or the fall or spring equinox, right? So you've now divided it into 4, and since we already know we have a year-long cycle, what happens when you divide it in 4? Well, surprise, surprise, we have 4 seasons. It lines up very nicely. And so we actually denote the start of the seasons based on when the sun crosses those 4 points. So those 4 points are called the four cardinal points because they are the start of something new. When the sun crosses crosses the equator from the south for the first time, that's the spring equinox. That's when now the days are beginning to be longer, right, than they were previously. They now the day below the equator they're shorter, above the equator they're longer. Again, from a northern hemisphere perspective. Once they reach the Tropic of Cancer, again there's a pivot. The sun is now moving in a different direction. It's now moving south. And so the days are going to begin to shrink. If we further divide each of those kind of 4 seasons, those 4 sections, right? Because if we think about the seasons, what happens during the season? You have obviously the beginning of a new season, right? Where things are beginning to change. The weather's warming up or the weather's getting cooler. But then you kind of have the middle of the season where you just have whatever change was made is now kind of constant. It's not really anything too crazy. But then towards the end, it starts to kind of get a little funnier, starts to change a little bit before you have a new change into a new season. And so that's dividing those 4 quadrants, right? The 4 seasons into 3 is how we get what we call the quadruplicities or the modalities. Why quad when we're dividing them into 3? It's because you already have 4. You already have 4 seasons, and you're going to have 4 kind of points, right? So you have 4 cardinal points, right? The 2 solstices, the 2 equinoxes. That's going to represent the 4 cardinal signs. That's where they'll start. And then you would have the kind of the fixed portions of each season, kind of in the middle. So that would be your 4 fixed signs. And then you would have the final section, the mutable or dual signs, which are going to represent the period where it's a transition. We're moving out of kind of staying and maintaining this kind of arc that the sun has been in, where the season is pretty constant. We got the same thing over and over and over and over for several days on end. But now we're getting to a new period where things are beginning to change, right? The weather is starting to cool off because we're moving out of the summer a little bit. Right, the sun has kind of gotten far enough away from us where it's getting a little colder, where we might start to see some rain or some snow, right, as we move into fall. And so you get that transition period. And the mutable signs, they're also called the dual signs, were always thought of as half fixed first and half cardinal, right, because they're kind of that weird split between the two. And then again, once you get to the next kind of cardinal point, one of the equinoxes, one of the solstices, that's when a new season begins. So you have 4 of each of the modalities, and they all, if we look at them on the wheel, they will form a 90 degree, or a square. They'll all be 90 degrees from each other, right? So every mutable sign is always 90 degrees from the other ones, or 180, and then same thing with the cardinal, same thing with the fixed, etc. And so they're called the quadruplicities because you have 4 of each of them. And so that was kind of the basic starting point. You had your 12, right, because of the full moons. But then we noticed, hey, right, if we just simply divide this, looking at these 4 cardinal points, divide the year into 4 seasons, well, we've already got our 12 full moons. 12 divided by 4 is 3, right? So you get your 3 kind of periods, 3 full moons within each season. And so we're kind of combining all these things. Then lastly, you have the elements. We have 4 elements. They call that the triplicities to keep things as confusing as possible. But it's because you will have 3 of each element, basically. 3 signs of each element, which is why it's called triplicity. Now, the elements are a little different. It has to do with the seasons a little bit, but I will cover that in a future episode because I didn't want this one to go too long. But in a quick thing about the modalities or the quadruplicities, depending on how you want to say it, is they can tell us a lot about somebody, because as much as they kind of show the changing relationship astronomically of what what's happening with the sun and the changing of the seasons, things like that. The whole idea of astrology is we're looking at the sky to get a reference, right? Look at how things are in the sky to kind of get an idea of, okay, how does that translate for us? Because there's some kind of weird, mirroring, right? The phrase that's often used is as above, so below. But it's this idea that we kind of see some kind of weird synchronicity between what we see in the sky and what happens to us on Earth. So that means if we look at a chart and it's got a lot of a particular modality, right, we can expect that person to entertain or have a lot of that same quality, much like we would, right, see in the sky. So that's one of the kind of the key things we want to keep in mind, why we look or why we divide it into 12. It's those are kind of the two main things. And as I said, with the modalities, we want to know that we can apply that to a person. And I'll talk more in depth about each of them in a further episode, because I do think it's extremely important and extremely helpful. If you know the modalities and the elements of somebody, right? Just like last podcast, we talked about the big three. You know the big three of somebody, you can really get a good sense of who they are, right, at a basic level. Kind of their underlying motivations, the conscious motivations, as well as kind of the framework through which they're going to operate. You can really understand that if you know the big three. If you understand the modalities or the elements of somebody, that's going to give you another flavor of how they're going to operate. Kind of their, maybe not so much their motivations, but kind of the style, the vibe of the personality, so to speak. And so we'll cover that in next couple episodes, looking at some of that stuff. The elements in particular, I think, are quite fascinating because they add a lot of kind of a polarity to the chart and to an individual by extension. And they're kind of interesting things to look at. So yeah, that's why we divide by 12 on the chart, at least one of the main things. So hope you enjoyed. Keep in mind next week we'll cover the modalities, the elements, a little bit more in depth. We'll probably split that in a couple episodes, but we'll go from there. All right, thanks for listening.